A simple clay jar, a bit of water, and dry air once did what bulky early refrigerators struggled to do: keep food cool, fresh and safe without a single wire or moving part. Long before electricity became reliable, this quiet technology was already winning. This story starts before humming motors, before Freon coils, before the refrigerator became a kitchen staple. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mechanical refrigeration existed, but it was expensive, unreliable, and often dangerous. Early refrigerators leaked toxic gases, broke down frequently, and demanded constant maintenance. Meanwhile, across hot regions of Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and parts of the Mediterranean, people were cooling food every day using nothing more than physics, patience, and clay. This wasn't folk magic. It was applied science, refined through centuries of lived experience. What made it remarkable wasn't just that it worked. It's that, in the right conditions, it worked better than some of the earliest refrigerators ever built. The cooling jar, often called a pot-in-pot system, relied on evaporative cooling. Two unglazed clay pots were nested together, with wet sand packed in the gap between them. Food went inside the inner pot. The outer pot was kept damp. As water slowly evaporated through the porous clay, it pulled heat away from the inner chamber. This is the same principle that cools your skin when sweat evaporates. No electricity, no ice, no chemicals, just thermodynamics doing its thing. In dry, well-ventilated environments, temperatures inside these jars could drop by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius below ambient air temperature. In some cases, even more. That was enough to keep vegetables crisp, milk usable for longer, and cooked food from spoiling overnight. Early refrigerators, by comparison, often struggled to maintain stable internal temperatures. Many relied on blocks of harvested ice. Others used early compression systems that fluctuated wildly and broke down under heat. The humble clay jar had no such mood swings. You know, we tend to romanticize early refrigeration as if it was some kind of instant leap forward. But honestly, it wasn't. Iceboxes, for example, needed constant ice deliveries, and that meant only folks in cities or wealthier households could really use them. Then, when mechanical refrigerators came around in the early 1900s, they used refrigerants like ammonia, sulfur dioxide, and methyl chloride. These substances did the job, sure, but leaks were pretty common and sometimes even fatal. Maintenance, well, that was another big issue. Compressors failed, seals leaked, and the power supply could be, really inconsistent. In a lot of rural areas, electricity just didn't exist yet. Meanwhile, the cooling jar worked just about anywhere the air was dry enough. No grid needed, no fuel, and no moving parts to fail. It didn't freeze food, but, freezing wasn't always the goal. Preservation was. For fresh produce, dairy and leftovers meant to last a few days. The clay jar often did the job more reliably than early machines. What's often missed is that these jars weren't crude stopgaps. They were optimized tools shaped by environment. The clay had to be porous but not brittle. The sand grain's size mattered. Too fine and water wouldn't evaporate efficiently. Too coarse and it wouldn't retain moisture. Placement mattered too. Jars were kept in shaded, breezy areas, elevated slightly to allow airflow underneath, re-wetted once or twice a day, depending on heat and humidity. This was systems thinking before the term existed. Generations refined these details without textbooks or laboratories. Trial, error, memory, and shared knowledge did the work. By the time Western engineers were patenting refrigeration units, this cooling method was already ancient. Here's where things get interesting. Early refrigerators could cool deeply, but not steadily. Temperature swings were common, especially in hot climates. That's bad for food safety. Bacteria thrive in fluctuating temperatures. The cooling jar delivered slow, steady cooling. It didn't shock food. It gently lowered temperature and maintained it as long as evaporation continued. That consistency extended shelf life in ways early refrigerators sometimes failed to do. Leafy greens stayed crisp. Tomatoes didn't rot as fast. Cooked grains lasted another day. Milk soured more slowly. For daily survival, that mattered more than ice-cold butter. You find variations of this system across continents for a reason. It scaled well. Anyone could make one with local materials. It didn't require trade networks, spare parts, or outside energy. In hot, arid regions, it was a quiet revolution. Families could store food longer. Markets could reduce waste. Travellers could keep provisions usable on long journeys. Even in the early 20th century, when refrigerators began entering urban homes, cooling jars remained common in rural areas. Not because people were behind the times, but because the jar made more sense. No fuel cost, no breakdowns, no waiting for ice. The cooling jar just worked, quietly and reliably, without any extra expenses or hassles. This method wasn't universal. High humidity reduces evaporative cooling dramatically. In tropical coastal regions, the effect weakens, That's where fermentation, drying and salting dominated instead. Understanding that limitation is part of respecting the technology. It wasn't a miracle cure. It was a precise solution for specific conditions, and in those conditions it excelled. That precision is what modern survival culture often forgets. Tools aren't good or bad in isolation. They're good or bad in context. The cooling jar understood its context perfectly. Off-grid cooling isn't a novelty anymore. It's becoming relevant again. Power outages, rising energy costs, fragile supply chains. Suddenly, a clay pot and some sand don't sound so primitive. The cooling jar reminds us that resilience often comes from subtraction, not addition. Fewer parts, less dependency, and, more understanding of natural processes. It also forces a rethink of progress. Early refrigerators represented technological ambition, but not always better outcomes. The jar, on the other hand, represented quiet efficiency. Sometimes the old way wasn't just good enough. It was, in fact, superior. This isn't nostalgia. It's respect for human ingenuity under constraint. The cooling jar wasn't invented to be clever. It was invented to solve a real problem with what was available. That's the heart of survival history. Practical knowledge, tested by heat, hunger and time, passed down because it worked. And, well, the fact that it could outperform early refrigerators in everyday reliability should make us pause. Not to reject modern technology, but really to remember that intelligence didn't begin with electricity. If you found this fascinating, stick around. These quiet, overlooked solutions are everywhere in history, just waiting to be understood again. Like the video if it gave you a new perspective. Share it with someone who thinks innovation only moves forward. And hey, subscribe to Legacy of Survival for more stories where human ingenuity beats complexity every time.